Welcome to Plants, People, Science, a podcast by the American Society for Horticulture Science, where we like to talk about all things horticulture.
I'm Samson Humphrey. I'm a PhD student researcher at the University of Tennessee, and I'm one of your co-hosts.
I am your other co-host, Kurt Rome, a university professor from the University of Arkansas. We want to welcome our audience today. Thank you for taking the time to join us in this conversation. You know, Samson, I'm looking forward to today's conversation. And part of my past research life was being a fruit breeder. And I always think it's fascinating to talk to breeders about their approach, the kind of things that help them form their breeding objectives and the directions they take.
Oh, absolutely. And the fact that it is such a team sport, it's such a team effort. And the way that people go about these collaborations seems to be entirely just varied. I really love seeing these varied experiences from breeders across different crops, across horticulture.
And, you know, this particular episode today was kind of based on really an award-winning publication in one of our ASHS journals. So it caught the eye of the peers in our society as well. I think it's fascinating, as we'll find, to explore the idea of how we in the academic world, which we're often accused of being in the ivory tower and being isolated from culture, society, and our stakeholders. Today, our episode will really talk about how stakeholders are engaged in the process of developing horticultural plants.
Absolutely. And then it's called participatory plant breeding. That's what our focus is on today. Our guest is Dr. Ambar Carvallo Lopez. And we invited her, like you said, Kurt, because her paper won the ASHS Vegetable Publication Award. Her work was on breeding tomatoes in a participatory plant breeding program. On this podcast, we've never actually had a discussion about what participatory plant breeding is, so we jumped at the chance to have her on. Ambar got her PhD in plant breeding and genetics at the University of Wisconsin-Madison doing this tomato work, and now she's at the University of British Columbia doing a participatory plant breeding with carrots. Let's take a listen.
Today, we're happy to be joined by Ambar Carvallo Lopez. Dr. Carvallo Lopez, tell us a little bit about you. Where are you at now? And before we get going, can I ask you a question? We want this to be a good conversation. And how do you prefer to be called? I mean, I know you're a kind of a recent PhD. Do you prefer to be called doctor, or would you like us to call you Ambar for the conversation?
Hi, Kurt. First of all, it's a pleasure to be part of the podcast. Ambar is just fine.
Okay.
Yeah.
We'll do that. So give us a little bit about your background. Where are you at now, and how did you get to where you're at? Introduce yourself for us.
Yeah, for sure. So right now, I'm a postdoc at the University of British Columbia, and I'm doing research on carrot genomics involving both kind of like participatory plant breeding, working with farmers, as well as looking more into the genetics of heat tolerance and drought tolerance for improving crops for the, changing climates and increasing temperatures around the world, specifically in Canada.
Well, that's a big challenge because definitely the climate's changing and, we need to have a more diverse, nutritious food supply.
Yes, definitely. And then it like my studies and my career kind of like naturally led me to this. I did my PhD in the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where I was working in a different crop, but similar approaches. I was working with tomato breeding for organic systems, also involving participatory breeding, and we can talk more about that in a few minutes. And as well as looking at fruit quality, because people are not too happy about the flavor of tomatoes right now. So we're trying to see how we can improve the quality of the fruit, following, using genomic tools, trying to find the genes controlling for fruit quality, and focusing on the needs of organic and local systems.
Yeah, really important stuff. I was so excited. That's why we're talking with you today, is because you won the publication award for that manuscript, for this tomato manuscript about participatory plant breeding.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And I was so surprised. First, I didn't know that such a word existed. So it was a really happy surprise to receive that. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to go to the conference to receive it, but it was nice to see this kind of work, especially because we were focusing on the participatory approach and how we've worked closely with farmers to improve these tomato lines. To have that highlighted in the scientific community, because sometimes that can be left aside a little bit.
Yeah, it's a fantastic paper. I'm really excited to talk about your tomato work. But before we get there, how did you start? How did you come into and become this scientist you are today?
Yeah, that's always a fun question to answer because it wasn't too much of a straight line. I got into agriculture pretty randomly, I want to say. I knew I liked the outdoors, I liked plants, and when deciding for a career in undergrad, agriculture seemed like it could be a good fit, although I'm not coming from a farming background at all. And throughout those years of learning about agriculture, agronomy, and horticulture, I realized that that was what I was passionate about. And then I got an opportunity to do a 5-week internship or apprenticeship in the Netherlands, like in my third year in undergrad, to work in lilies breeding, so flower breeding. And by working closely with the breeder there, who was so passionate about his work, that really opened up the whole world of seed production, seed improvement, and what that means for agriculture in general. So that's how I started. And, those things that happened very, randomly. This opportunity came, out of nowhere to this specific program, a university, and then they chose 5 students. Not really a very clear way of choosing those students. And anyways, so that's how I got interested in plant breeding. And after finishing my undergrad, I kind of wanted to experience different areas of agriculture. So fruit production, vine production, and vegetable production. I worked for a year in ornamental propagation in California, and that kind of like settled what I liked and what I didn't like in terms of me joining an industry. And I was very lucky to find a master's program that kind of included both of the things that I was starting to get passionate about, which was sustainable farming and plant breeding. And then I got in contact with Julie Dawson at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and she was working on tomato breeding for organic farming systems, among other projects, of course. So yeah, things worked out, really well. And then I got the possibility to keep exploring that path.
It's really cool too. You said you wanted more experience with different crops, fruits and vegetables, and different things. And here you are. Like you did your PhD with fruits and with tomatoes, and now you're doing vegetables. You're doing carrots and maybe other things and root crops. And it's so exciting to see that you haven't necessarily like nailed yourself down and that you're still exploring.
Yes, definitely. I think it's always good to keep an open mind, because when you're doing your master's or PhD, you have to go very deep into one crop, right? And one trait or something very specific. And it's not always the case that you're going to continue working with the same crop. So for me, it was very exciting to find the current project that I'm working with. It's a new crop. It's a biennial crop, which the seed production system is completely different. We have to do 2 seasons. So a lot of learning through this process.
So what attracted you to the University of Wisconsin? Was it Dr. Dawson's program? And were you interested in the project that she had, or were you interested in the crop, or was it Wisconsin? How did you get that match? So was it really that you wanted to work with Dr. Dawson?
It was a mix of things. First, the University of Wisconsin-Madison is very renowned for their agricultural program and their plant breeding program specifically. So that's something that I was eyeing from the beginning. And then I started to search who I could work with, who could be a good match. And there were, of course, multiple professors that I thought they were doing interesting things. And so Wisconsin was a new place for me. Of course, I hadn't been there before. I had to look up the weather, very harsh winters. Me coming from Chile, from a Mediterranean climate, was definitely going to be a challenge. But I was excited about it to leave something different. Excuse me. I also saw there were multiple lakes in the area, so trying to see the positive sides of the region. And then, of course, learning about the work of Julie really, settled my decision of applying there.
Well, I think Wisconsin's a great school, but I say that with a lot of bias because my father got his PhD in the Department of Horticulture.
Oh, that's wonderful.
At the University of Wisconsin. And my brother got a PhD from the University of Wisconsin. And they do have a long standing tradition, 75 plus years in vegetable breeding.
Correct.
And, for a long time. And a lot of the innovations in our vegetable system have really occurred there. And then even some of our fundamental knowledge with quick plants, really. So that's a great place for you to land.
Yeah, it is.
So tell us about your dissertation project. That's what we really want to dig into. So,
okay.
Were you kind of assigned that, or was this something that was in the general work that Dr. Dawson was her field, and you really wanted to dig into a project? Go through the set it up for us. How did it go?
Yeah, for sure. I think it's something that we kind of built together. The tomato breeding program was already happening, which was mainly the participatory breeding. So when I got there, just to paint the picture, they had already started with a breeding program, which means that they had selected some parental lines based on what the farmers were saying they were interested in, what they needed in terms of disease resistance, fruit quality. And then they already had made some crosses and had at least 3 generations in which they were sending seed back to farmers. Farmers were evaluating the different lines in their farms, making their own selections, and then sending seed back to us at the program, and then continuing that iterative process. So I got there when it had been already like 2 or 3 years of this to continue the work and finalize those lines, continue the selection process, the pipeline. And so that was the my master's thesis. And then when we were talking with my advisor there, we really wanted to get deeper into how can we improve fruit quality if the genetic variations may be very limited. Do we want to maybe use heirlooms? How do we set this up? And so that's how we proposed the second big chapter, or third, I can't remember which one it was. But so this one, we were trying to do more like genetic analysis, and this is the manuscript that I'm working on right now that I'm trying to finish on carrying out a diallel system mating design between heirlooms and some modern lines, and see if we can bring back some of that genetic diversity that might bring as well flavor and other fun tomato characteristics. So that's like the 2 parts of my PhD. And then I also did a lot of work on disease resistance. So there's 2 diseases in Wisconsin that affect tomatoes. Well, one of the mains, which are septoria leaf spot and early blight. And they're both fungal. They're both foliar diseases that when they get in the field, they're really hard to control, especially for organic farmers, because there's not that many tools or products that you can use. So it's more on the prevention. So we partnered up with a local seed company and the University of Cornell University, where they had done all the pre-breeding work to find genes and potential genetic markers associated with septoria resistance. So that was a whole other area of my project in which I was able to look at tomatoes from different perspectives for adaptation, for quality improvement, as well as disease resistance.
That sounds like the ideal PhD project. You got to look at all those different things.
Yeah. I was very lucky that I had the flexibility. I was given the flexibility to do that, and the support of my team, of course, because all of this involves multiple field trials, multiple locations. We had a field trial at the seed company, so like building strong relationships with them was very important as well.
That is so cool. So let's take a back up here, because you mentioned organic producers. And then also one of the features of your paper was about participatory plant breeding. So could you tell us a little bit about conventional breeding and how that differs from participatory plant breeding?
Yes, definitely. So I think, just to put this into perspective, conventional breeding, it's the way that or breeding in general, it's the way we are trying to improve crops for humans to, get more yields or get benefited by growing certain crops. And so throughout the years, we've been selecting for different traits like yield or disease resistance. And every time that we make that selection, we potentially lose other traits. And so that's the general, very summarized way of talking about plant breeding. And then conventional plant breeding is a very centralized process, right? There's either a seed company or sometimes either public efforts in a university or other institutions. A lot of those decisions are made within, a very small group of people. They're working on specific traits, generally working for conventional agriculture, which means there's a lot of relying on fertilizer, like high input use, fertilizers, pesticides, they're uniform, growing systems. And so this kind of like varieties they're developed and then released. Sometimes they perform really well in conventional settings, but when you go into less, input farming systems, either organic or just because people don't have access to these products, the varieties don't really perform that well because they have been bred under these, high input conditions. So participatory plant breeding started in developing countries because of this specific issue, because farmers couldn't rely on this conventionally bred seed. It was expensive. And so they started doing their own selections on farm, and kind of like collaborating with each other. And so there are many different levels on how participatory plant breeding can be, carried out. And because it started in developing countries and in the systems that were low input use, it kind of like made sense for organic agriculture to kind of like mimic or learn from this approach, because organic systems are very varied, very diverse, usually low input use. I'm not saying there's no fertilization, because there's compost use, of course, there's organic pesticides, but it's more reduced as well. And of course, organic farmers or local farmers that sell in the farmers markets, they're looking at different traits that conventional big ag. And so there's a different need for those markets. And so for organic farming, it's been something that has been developing in the last few years, in different crops, mostly vegetables and grains. There's been longstanding grain participatory plant breeding programs. And basically now what it looks like, it can be, the farmer can be part of the decision making from the beginning on deciding what are the traits that are going to be improved, who's going to be making the crosses, who's going to be making the selection and the evaluation. So that's kind of like an overview of participatory plant breeding. And I do want to say that there's a lot of information out there and there's so many different ways of doing it. But kind of like the approach that we used at the University of Wisconsin-Madison was getting the consumer, which includes the farmer, the chefs, the actual people eating the crops, to talk about what do we want to see in tomatoes, what it's missing. And so that's how the objectives were set from the beginning. And that sets up the whole rest of the process.
Yeah, I'm very interested in that. Of course, this participatory plant breeding, as you're talking about it, I mean, it's a tremendous way from a breeding standpoint to better understand the genotype by environment interactions. So
Definitely.
that's wonderful. But back to your point, how did you set the breeding objectives? Who did you listen to? How did, very often as a former plant breeder, we kind of formulate those breeding objectives very individually, but this is a different approach. So who did you listen to? How did you incorporate that? And how did you value the different inputs you got, whether it be from a grower, the seed company, or the consumer, or, your breeding team?
Yeah, this is such a relevant question because it also indicates how other institutions could mimic. So how do you define those objectives? And for the program at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, as I mentioned, I got there when this had already started, but I can tell, how it happened before I got there. And basically participating in relevant organic farming conferences or roundtables. There were a couple of surveys sent out to understand the needs, the trait needs of conventional organic farmers, just to see what are differences. Are people thinking about the same things? And that's how it got set up. And of course, throughout the process, having check-ins with the farmers. And because they were also doing their selection in their farms, we could make sure that whatever that we're selecting, it's also including their preference. And just to tie it to what I'm doing right now, we're also carrying out a participatory, plant breeding project in carrots. And it's quite similar in the sense that, we saw the need that a lot of producing carrot seed in Canada, it's very hard. And so sourcing locally produced seed, it's not really a possibility. So it relies a lot on international markets and in other, producing systems. And so that need was definitely there. And also the availability of open pollinated varieties that could perform really well. Because a lot of people use the F1s. Then I want to be clear that I'm not saying that F1s are a bad thing, but some farmers would rather rely on open pollinated because if the F1 producing company decides to not produce it anymore, they don't have any other options that they trust. So basically we wanted to produce an open pollinated carrot variety that could work well in Canadian systems. And to do that, different parental lines were chosen. We carried out the crosses. We sent out seed to the farmers, and then they grow the roots, and then they send back the roots to us. We do the seed production in greenhouse, then we bulk that seed, and then we continue an iterative process. So, and again, we're always checking in with the farmers that are growing the carrots, or in the other case, the tomatoes.
Yeah, with the tomatoes, I would just think, and I'm really struck by this. I think it's an interesting and fascinating way to construct your breeding objectives, because a grower is going to tell me, yeah, yield is important to me. Disease resistance is real important for the organics, so I can reduce my inputs. I'm growing them inside of a controlled environment of a high tunnel, which is modified environments. Got to have something that can take that different kind of light quality and maybe different kinds of temperature regimes. Mm-hmm. Then the consumers are saying, I want a nice, red, round, really flavorful tomato. Mm-hmm. And, we hear consumers talking, very frequently, tomatoes are the bellwether of all fruits and vegetables. Those breeders have bred the flavor out of it. And here you are, talking to consumers and understanding that's important. I could also see with organic growers, because the organic promise is to deliver a high quality, nutrient dense, consumer acceptable product. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So exactly. How did you really dug into this flavor component?
Yeah, and that was definitely a new world for me. I hadn't studied what flavor entails and how we perceive it. And I got really into it to understand how that there's the question, why did we lose so much flavor in tomato? It's true. Even I, that I'm not that old, sometimes say the tomatoes that I ate when I was younger were tastier. So I can imagine that people that ate tomatoes 20 or 30 years ago could also taste the difference. And so there's been a lot of work done on this. There's a group, Tiemann et al., that they published a paper talking about the genetic roadmap to flavor improvement. And basically, they found that through domestication, where we were selecting for certain traits like yield and resist resistance, as well as plant structure, which is so important in tomatoes because we have to trellis them, we started to lose some of those genes that were positively correlated with flavor and accumulate certain genes that were, producing volatile compounds that are not, so good when we taste the tomato. So basically, getting worse flavor by both ways, losing the good genes and also accumulating the bad ones. And in small proportions, of course, because flavor is such a complex attribute. There's so many volatile compounds included in this, and as well as how we perceive it in terms of the texture. But that was very interesting to see. So there is a genetic challenge there. So to how much improvement we can make. And I think this is where it's key to go to germoplasm that maybe has been left aside for a bit, those heirloom lines that could look a little bit more wild, maybe not so productive, a little bit more of like cracking issues, but it can maybe harbor more of that genetic variance specifically for fruit quality. And that's what we were trying to do with the manuscript that I'm working on right now.
That's amazing. So you're going through this process, you're sending plant samples or seeds back to the farmers.
Seeds, yeah.
Seeds. And they're growing out a new crop and they're sending you back. How do you determine what should be released? How do you know when you're done with this like iterative long-term process?
Yeah, that's the other classic breeder question. Is this done? Are we ready? And I think there's in tomato, because it doesn't have inbreeding depression, it's nice. You can keep, self-pollinating it to reach something that is very uniform. So that's the fun thing with tomato, as well as how easy it is to make crosses. So usually when you reach the 7th generation, you start to see really good uniformity, and you just have to start to discard things that are clearly off type. And this is where you have to carry out larger trials. So you reduce the number of lines that you evaluate, but you increase the number of plants per line so you can truly see how uniform it is, how stable it is. Hopefully you are growing this in multiple environments to see some genetic by environment interactions until you reach to a point that, okay, if you're getting good feedback from the farmers, you're getting your data with decent yield. Again, we were not trying to come out with the best performing tomato that everyone can grow and it's going to be the best producing, but something that farmers felt like, okay, this was bred here, this was bred with my input, I know that where this is coming from. So actually we're in the process, or I say me, myself, and the team at UW-Madison, of working with the university, because of course there's some IP related processes that have to go through in terms of because the research was done at the university with university resources, navigating those things, because it is a participatory approach, the farmers are also authors and creators of this material. So we want to make sure that we can credit them. So yeah, that process, it's on the works, but yeah, there's 2 lines that we're really excited about, that we got really good feedback. And I'm really hoping to see it out there available for farmers and gardeners to grow.
That must be so rewarding after such a long process, and it having even started before you arrived there for your PhD. Oh my goodness. So did you ever get to go visit any of these farms and see the plants in the field out there?
Yeah. The farmers that participated were pretty spread out in the Midwest. So some in Wisconsin, some in Minnesota, mostly farther. But we did have a farmer join us like in the last 2 years of the evaluation. So I was and he grew a lot of plants. He was very excited. He loved the research. He also works at the university. So that's how he had such a close relationship. And so it was exciting to see the plants being grown in a different environment other than the research station. Even though we try to mimic what farmers do on their farms, we don't, we don't try to not spend too much time because farmers have very limited time to spend on each crop. So yeah, I was able to do that and see that they were quite uniform and they were performing similar to what we were seeing at the research station. So that was good.
I'm curious how your research plots are different from what you see on a typical farm or maybe that specific farm that you visited.
Yeah, so usually at our high tunnel or even in the open field, we have multiple replicated plots. In a farm, usually they're growing a few varieties, or if they're very diversified, they'll be growing many different varieties depending on their market. But we were really trying to mimic the conditions in terms of the trellising and how you're managing opening and closing the high tunnel, using straw as a mulch. So I would say it didn't differ so much, or I would like to think it didn't differ so much in terms of the watering, following the watering strategies as farmers were doing. So sometimes they'd say, oh, we water twice a week. We let it dry down a little bit. And so my first couple of years, I kind of like learned to do that. And then it came more naturally the following years.
Yeah, because this is like a more local effort, right? More local for breeding for these organic growers.
Definitely.
I want to go back and ask you about by the way, congratulations on the award-winning publication, the outstanding publication in ASHS journals related to vegetable crops. And for our listeners, I'm sitting here holding a copy of it. Improved tomato breeding lines adapted to organic farming systems have enhanced flavor, yield, and disease resistance. I mean, that is a conclusion in the title. But what were some of the other takeaways that you have for us? What else, those that are not going to read it and just going to listen to us today, are there some big takeaway messages, some things that you really learned that you're really pleased about and maybe excited about?
I think one big takeaway is that the approach works. You know, it does take a lot of effort. People ask like, well, is this financially, possible? Does it make sense in terms of the time? It is time intensive in how long it takes, but compared to a regular conventional breeding program, they also take time. So that's not such a huge difference. And I think in terms of one big difference is that because we worked closely with farmers from the beginning and they were already trialing the varieties almost when they're finished, the adaptation process of where the farmer decides to include this variety in their rotation or their season is much shorter, because a regular seed company goes through all this breeding process and reaches a somewhat finished line, and then they have to go through the marketing process of trialing these lines and convincing farmers to grow them. And so building that close partnership, that trust, is really important. So that's something besides, the other results that we got in terms of the yield and the disease resistance and the fruit quality. I think that's another key takeaway that I'd like people to take with them.
Absolutely. But it must be so difficult to keep up all of these relationships with these different farmers and to keep in contact with all of them. Did you have to, is that part of your role, all of that outreach, all of that communication?
It definitely is a challenge. I was very lucky that the program at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, they already had built a really good way of keeping relationships with farmers. I did, when I started my program in 2019, my master's, the COVID pandemic came. And so it was hard to, maintain those relationships for sure. So we had a little hiatus there on how many visits we would do to farmers, but definitely maintaining email connection and sometimes phone calls. I think that's something that has to have like a plan or like a process set up to make sure that you continue to build those relationships. And you can't expect farmers to like be answering you all the time and really sending you feedback throughout the season because they're very busy. So they're being very mindful of okay, maybe I'll reach out once or twice and we'll see and take it from there.
Okay, I'm going to ask you a very non-scientific question.
Okay.
But the question I'm sure you've been asked before. So you were breeding tomatoes for good flavor. What in your mind as a scientist or as a consumer, what is a really good tomato? What should it really taste like? What should its texture and its flavor? So, should they be sweet? Should they be tart? Should they be sour? What's a good tomato for those of us that maybe don't have them?
That haven't tried the perfect tomato
Haven't
yet.
tried. We're in the lifelong search of that perfect tomato.
A really good balance between sweetness and acidity. It's key, of course. But then also while getting involved in this project, I tried so many different tomatoes. And then umami became a thing that I was looking for. So that more like umami describes like the soy sauce flavor, something like that. And it's hard to put it into words without tasting it. But when I discovered that, I was like, oh, that's a flavor that I really like, or like the smokiness that sometimes some varieties might have. Really something that's more complex than just sweet tomato, for me at least. And this is definitely a question that varies. You'll get a very different response on the country you're at, the culture, and the texture as well. It varies if it's for fresh consumption, if it's for soup or tomato paste. So right now I'm talking about the fresh tomato. If I buy it at the farmer's market, I want something juicy with a good flavor complexity, and in texture, I guess something not too soft, but also not too crunchy, if that makes sense.
That makes a lot of sense. And I think it's remarkable, even in that program where you were breeding tomatoes for northern conditions. We don't normally think about Wisconsin, Minnesota, the Dakotas as being tomato states, but growing them in high tunnels, now you are actually creating a product that probably is with enhanced flavor, but also is probably being delivered more to local and regional markets, being delivered fresher as well, or in more mature. So that's a really notable thing in your project. I really appreciate that from the breeding efforts in Wisconsin.
Yeah, thank you. And it's something that attracted me too as well from the program, because the program itself is called Local and Regional Food Systems. So it basically just how do we support our local systems, and that's through breeding. There's a strong extension aspect to it as well, on evaluating different management practices. Another grad student was evaluating what's the actual difference between growing tomatoes in the open field, a caterpillar tunnel, which is a low financial commitment with the benefits of a covered structure, and the high tunnel. And what are how expensive is it? What's the labor involved? And so all of that really complemented the work that I was doing specifically in the breeding. So what you say, it's something that actually attracted me to join the group.
Yeah, that like research infrastructure around you, people studying different things that complement what you're doing.
Definitely.
Wow, that's incredible. So I am hearing a lot of like tones of community in this. There's the research community around you that's like feeding into your breeding work. There's the community and different communities at conferences and these grower events where you're talking to the people who are actually growing the tomatoes. There's a community that's local around you. What would you like our listeners to remember about your work or the things you've learned on this very, very interesting path?
Yeah, I think being curious about where your food comes from, I think that's something that I always kind of like stop and ask myself when I'm going to the grocery store or going to the farmer's market. The fruit and vegetables that we see out there, it's not just producing them. There's so much work behind people making decisions on what do we want to breed for, where is this variety going to work well. Are we focusing on flavor, disease resistance, what management practices are the farmers using? So there's so much work behind every crop that we grow and that we eat. And so, yes, in community, it's such a big aspect of this because none of this is done by a single person or even a single institution. There's so many connecting points on getting the food from the field to your table. And I think I personally like to stop and think about that as often as I can. I'm not thinking about it every single day, but I like to bring it up because it makes us value as well more what we're eating and, the work that farmers do as well.
Amber, you've made me, reminded me that when I go to the grocery store, I need to think about that the entire part of our food system, where that food, how it was delivered to the store where I buy it or the farmer's market, the farmer who grew it and the growing conditions in which they grew it. But even back behind that, there are people like you. There are those scientists, those breeders that are working to create a better product for the farmer as well as a better product for the consumer. Well, Amber, you had a tremendous story. This was really interesting, and I learned a lot about both participatory breeding and in your particular program. Really appreciate you coming today and sharing your story with us.
Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate the invitation, and I'm always happy to talk about tomatoes and now carrots as well. That maybe can be at another time.
Well, I'll be looking for some British Columbia and Canadian carrots.
Yeah, so. We'll try to get there.
Well, thank you very much for joining us. And Samson, always great to have a conversation with you. I thought today was a lot of fun.
So did I, Kurt. Thank you so much, Amber, for coming on.
Thank you, everyone. Take care.
Wow, that was a fantastic interview. Oh my goodness. Before reading this paper and talking with Ambar, I was not aware of what participatory plant breeding was. This was so cool.
Again, getting that involvement from growers and farmers, not only on the front end where they're creating the breeding objectives, so you're really breeding to make a difference, but getting them involved in the evaluations, and so they can give you some real world feedback. I mean, it's kind of it was Amber's dissertation. I mean, it was really good science, but there was a little bit of aspect of a citizen science kind of involved in that. And I think that's really valuable. Also, I was really interested in, and it was a great lesson to remind me that a dissertation can make a difference. So that work, digging in, and in her case, involving others in her program and involving the constituents around the state and the region, I think she was able to make some real significant progress for tomatoes for that region of the United States, which we normally don't think about as being a tomato growing region.
Yeah, thank you for highlighting that reminder, Kurt. I'm doing my PhD right now, and I think it can be so easy to get down in the weeds of, I have this problem right now with this sensor, and it's just getting caught up on all these small things that you have to solve on your way to getting the PhD. But you're right that there can be a very large scale impact. You really do impact the people around you, the people you work with, and those collaborations into the future, as well as the research outputs that you put out that hopefully do benefit growers far, far into the future. I'll try to keep that one in mind.
Yeah, well, science is a progressive thing. So, and I think this was a great example of that dissertation that made a difference. Mm-hmm. It was recognized as an award-winning publication, and now Amber's gone on to another institution where I'm sure she'll be making a difference as well. Samson, I enjoy the conversation with you. It's always good to catch up. I learned a lot today, to be quite honest. It was very informative as well as enjoyable. So this is Kurt Rome and my co-host Samson Humphrey. Thank you for joining Plants, People, Science.
Thanks for listening.
The ASHS podcast, Plants, People, and Science, is made possible by member dues and volunteerism. please go to ashs.org to learn more. If you're not already a member of the ASHS, we invite you to join. ASHS is a not-for-profit, and your donations are tax-deductible.
This episode was hosted by Samson Humphrey and Kurt Rome. Special thanks to our audio engineer, Andrew Sheldorf, our research specialists, Lena Wilson and Andrew Sheldorf, our ASHS support team, Sarah Powell and Sally Murphy, and our musician, John Clark. Thanks for listening.